Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. Today's Do You Know question is, do you know the correlation between priesthood and celibacy? It's important to define the terms first of all. Celibacy basically means that a person promises not to marry. Currently, in our Catholic tradition, anyone who's called to the priesthood is obliged to be celibate, to not marry. This is not true for the Orthodox tradition, nor for the Protestant tradition as well. So in order to understand this, it's important to go back to the early church. Where did celibacy come from, and so on? Let's start with Jesus. Jesus himself was a Jew, and in the Jewish tradition, marriage and children were valued, especially in terms of carrying on the family name and the family reputation, as well as being remembered when one dies, and so on. So family and children were very important in the Jewish tradition. All of Jesus' disciples were married, as far as we can tell, and all the disciples that followed them, popes, priests, bishops, deacons, were all married. As a matter of fact, we have two sons who followed their fathers as popes of the church in the early church. And so we know that marriage was very much valued and considered a normal way of living for any clergy member, and so on. So where did celibacy come from? Well, it came from two influences that began to enter the church. The first influence came from the Greek philosophical tradition, especially from Plato. And the other reason was primarily a financial situation that the church was facing. Let's take one at a time. The first one is the influence of Greek philosophy, especially Platonism, or from Plato. Plato understood his philosophical tradition as elevating the spirit, the mind, over the body. And he saw the body as a distraction to the spirit and to the mind. And therefore, he felt that in order, if one wanted to grow intellectually and spiritually, one had to discipline the body in order to be closer to God, to be more spiritual, and to be more intellectually developed. And so as a result, early on, this kind of perspective and attitude influenced church teaching and began to develop a kind of basic anti-body, anti-passions, primarily focused on sexuality. And so as a result, it was understood that in order for one to be more spiritual and closer to God, one had to really suppress or do away with strong passions that would divert you from your spiritual and intellectual development. And sexuality was seen as one of the strongest passions. And therefore, it soon became associated with negative attitudes and perspectives that ultimately led to a suppression of it if you wanted to be really holy and spiritual. There were a lot of anti-sexual and anti-passion treatises written by many of the early fathers of the church, which led to a negation of marriage and an elevation, if you want, of the celibacy in the tradition of the clergy. So as a result of that, what started to happen is that the church felt that if you needed to be a clergy person, then you needed to definitely be one who was celibate, who was more closer to God as a result of not being married, not having to worry about relationship with one's wife or sexuality in general. And so as a result, we had that tendency that ultimately moves itself towards celibate priesthood. The other tradition was, the other influence was primarily a financial one. The priest family considered the church land that they were living on and ministering on to be their own, and the priest felt that he could pass that on as an inheritance to his children. As a matter of fact, oftentimes the oldest son was actually groomed to be the follow-up priest to the father. And so what would happen is the family considered the land to be theirs and that they could pass it on as an inheritance to the children. The church was not very pleased with this at all, and so one of the best ways to resolve the situation was to demand that priests no longer be married. So in 1139, over 1100 years later, in 1139, the church establishes a rule of celibacy for all those who desire to be priests. Now, many of the priests objected, and as a result were probably faithful to the letter of the law, but had live-ins and even concubines to kind of be their partners and so on. By the Council of Trent in 1563, the celibacy was reinforced to the nth degree, and to this day we have a celibate priesthood in the Western tradition. There are certain exceptions, though, that we have made since the Second Vatican Council. For example, we've welcomed Anglicans and Lutheran priests from other traditions to come into our tradition. We reordain them, and we do allow them to keep their family and their children and so on. And so even in this diocese, in our own diocese in Kansas City St. Joseph, we have 3 married priests, Catholic married priests, who serve and minister to the people in this diocese. One last item, which is really very interesting. In mission countries where the priesthood level is very low, many of the bishops have been petitioning Pope Francis if they could ordain married people to the priesthood. And Pope Francis seems to be very open to that. And would be interesting to see where it would go in the future. But I just wanted to explain a bit of the correlation between priesthood and celibacy and how it grew and developed, and to remember that this is a church rule that can be changed at any time if the church felt it was good for the ministry of the church to change that rule. So I hope this has helped a bit to understand the correlation between priesthood and celibacy, and I hope you will return once again to more Do You Know questions to learn more about our faith and our traditions. Thank you very much.